So now before we move on to actually putting the whole game together, we want to clean up the last few things on the player. The first thing we'll do is we're going to turn the player into a prefab by dragging him from the scene into our prefabs folder. With our player prefab selected, let's go in and add two more components. The first component we're going to want to create is the destroy off screen. The other component we're going to want to create is the recycled game object. We spent a lot of time building the basic foundation for all of this to work, and it took a while for us to get here. But now you can see, in order for us to create recyclable game objects that take advantage of our object pool and can also be destroyed when they're off screen and are smart enough to know whether the game object needs to be recycled or not, we simply just need to start adding these little behaviors onto our component. And because all of our code is incredibly modular and self-sufficient, we're able to now make this reusable throughout the rest of our project. Other objects we'll add later on in the project, or even your own games as you move on from the course. Let's just test out that all this works. Before we hit play, though, I want to point out a very interesting thing about prefabs. You'll notice I made a special point about selecting the prefab itself and not the version of it inside of the hierarchy. We've been modifying the base object of what our player is in the game. If we look at the instance in the scene, though, and scroll to the bottom, you'll see that it now also has the same scripts. Now, there's one thing that we want to change, and we'll take this as an opportunity to explain the difference between how working with an instance of a prefab versus the actual prefab works. So you just saw that any changes we made to this prefab filter down to any instance of the prefab in the scene. Now what happens in the reverse way? Here we have our player selected in the hierarchy. You see we have our destroy offset script. What we're going to do is increase the offset value so it takes a little bit longer before we destroy our player when they're off screen. Let's change this to 36. Now you'll notice this property is now bold. This lets us know that we've made a change to our instance of the prefab and not the actual prefab itself. If we were to go and look at the prefab, you'll see that the offset value is still 16. Let's go back to the player in the scene itself and scroll all the way to the top. Here we have a menu for our prefab, which I had pointed out earlier when we made our first prefab. We're going to press the Apply button, and if we scroll back down now, you'll see that offset is no longer bold. If we go to our player prefab, you'll see that the offset value has now been updated to 36. If we were to make changes in the prefab itself, and we had an instance in the scene, but those changes didn't come over, let's say we were customizing changes here and the two conflicted, you can always scroll up to the top of an instance of a prefab in the scene and click Revert to get all the changes back from the base prefab. Now let's run our scene and make sure that when our player goes off the screen, they get disabled. Here you'll see they're deleted, and the player is now grayed out. You'll also see that the player's instance still exists in the scene, it's just stopped right here, and it's no longer active. You can also visualize this by looking and seeing here in the inspector that next to the player's object, it's not checked. If we were to check this, you'd see they'd reappear and disappear off the screen. Now the player also fits within the recycled system of our game and now can be part of an object pool. So when we create a new game, we'll use an object pool to create the player, and when the player dies, we'll simply reinstantiate the player from the pool itself. This is incredibly powerful, and I'll keep reiterating it because now, whenever our game runs for the first time, it's going to create all the objects it needs in the object pool, and then later on, we'll never get a performance hit again when we create new objects because we'll be recycling all the ones that we've created. Next, we're going to start breaking out and building up the logic that'll actually make the game run.